On July 23, 1851, the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux was signed in Minnesota by 35 Native American leaders of Dakota tribes. This treaty was with Governor Alexander Ramsey with other government officials. The Dakota chiefs misinterpreted the treaty, for most of them didn't thoroughly understand English or the treaty's context. The treaty was not written to benefit the Dakota. The treaty gave 24 million acres of Native American land in Minnesota to the United States. After this treaty was signed, settlers, traders, farmers, merchants, and missionaries flooded into the Minnesota Territory. The treaty also made the Dakota move their tribes to small and fertile reservations that could not sustain them on the eastern side of Minnesota. On these reservations, the Dakota people were forced to live under rules, customs, and regulations not of their own. Most of the few reservations were just 10 miles long. The Dakota people starved and died as the U.S. dishonored the treaty payments of gold and food supplies they were supposed to give every June to the Dakota. Later on, white settlers began to settle on the Native American reservations. This caused the Dakota people to be pushed out of their small reservations of Minnesota and onto unknown enemy territory. Andrew Myrick, a trader, infamously stated that, "As far as I'm concerned, they can eat grass or dirt." After mistreatment, broken promises, and being pushed out of their homeland, the tribes of the Dakota and others near congressed and began the plot of warfare. On August 17, 1862, in Acton Township, 4 Dakota huntsmen found eggs on the baker's farm. The starving huntsmen murdered 5 settlers for the eggs, thus beginning the Dakota War of 1862. As the Civil War raged on, the Dakota War erupted. Soon murders, battles, fights, and raids on both sides arose. They were led by Little Crow and on the opposing side, Brigadier Henry H. Sibley. During the time of war, the winter of starvation began, crops failed, and hunting game became scarce. Newspapers turned people against the Dakota by saying they were vermin and by creating untruthful stories. Henry Whipple was a bishop in the Baptist Church who befriended Native Americans and protested against their mistreatment and sought peace for them. The last battle of the Dakota War was at Wood Lake. This is when Sibley defeated the Dakota force led by Little Crow. On September 26, after 37 days of war, the Dakotas surrendered and gave up hostages. This is called the Surrender of Camp Release. 2 days later, Sibley and military officers began the trials of Dakota people accused of participating in battles or massacres. These trials were fast and hasty. A Native American only needed 1 adult or child witness to be ruled guilty. Most of the Dakota were scarcely allowed to say a word or didn't understand the language during the trials. There was around 400 trials in 42 days at Camp Release. This resulted in 330 Dakota people condemned to die.
A situation that was very unjust for the Native Americans who were involved. The fact that the trials were conducted in such a speedy manner and with the language barriers that existed, that multiple people could be tried together, that the trials were done so rapidly. It obviously wasn't a fair situation for the Dakota.
When the 303 convicted landed in Mankato to be executed, they were placed in a large shed made out of logs. Though Lincoln was busy with ending the Civil War, he reviewed the transcripts with government lawyers. This resulted in 39 Dakota warriors destined for execution. Most of the men sentenced for execution were not guilty or had done petty crimes in the Dakota War. The execution was scheduled for the 19th of December, but it was delayed for the fear of retaliation by the lynch mobs. On December 23rd, the 39 condemned Dakota danced, sung, and were permitted visits with family. Before the day of the execution, 1 Dakota man got a reprieve and was released. On December 26, 1862, the day after Christmas, the executions took place on the banks of the Minnesota River in Mankato. The Dakota 38 had sacks put on their heads and climbed up the large scaffold as they sang the Dakota death song.
Their captors in a display that fascinated the reporters. They shook hands with the officers who came in among them, bidding them goodbye as if they were going on a long and pleasant journey.
Each man had an assigned spot on the scaffold. At 10 a.m., Captain Dooley, who had lost family members in the Dakota War, took his place by the rope and waited for the 3 drum beats. On the 3rd beat, his axe came down on the rope. The trapdoor fell and the Dakota warriors spent half an hour hanging from the scaffold. While a Dakota man was being hung, his rope broke, so the soldiers brought him back up and hung him again. After the hangings, the bodies were put into a small, shallow grave. The day after the hangings, doctors dug up the corpses and took them away for medical experiments. A week later, it was discovered that 2 Dakota men had been mistakenly hung, and the real men that were supposed to be hung were hunted and later executed. After the hangings, 1,700 Dakota in Fort Snelling, Free Dakota, Winnebagos, and Ojibways were gathered together by soldiers. The U.S. government forced them to the Mississippi. From there, the 3,000 Native Americans from those tribes were sent down the Mississippi by steamboats. They were forced out of Minnesota and onto the Dakotas, Montana, Manitoba, and other parts of the Great Plains. Other Native American tribes lived in these areas. Some of the tribes were enemies of the natives from Minnesota or reluctant to let the 3,000 live in their land.
They were made to go to South Dakota, they were made to go down to Nebraska or, wherever they were pushed out of Minnesota.
From there, the Dakota dispersed into small Dakota tribes or other Native American tribes. In 1977, Reconciliation Park was dedicated in Mankato. The park covers where the Dakota 38 were executed. In it, there is a monument that lists all 38 names and a prayer to the Great Spirit. Every year, there is a Dakota 38+2 ride. Dakota descendants ride by horseback from Lower Brule Reservation in South Dakota to Reconciliation Park. The ride takes 17 days and ends on December 26th, the same day as the executions. The ride is a time for peace, remembrance, and reflection, a small victory for the Dakota people.